Welcome to the latest edition of the Lownie Report, and what a week it's been. We have had even more disclosures from the release of the Epstein Files. It's shown the relationship that Andrew and indeed Sarah Ferguson had with Epstein was even deeper and longer than we realized. A whole series of very embarrassing emails. The questions are now being raised about whether Andrew could now be charged under the misuse of abuse of sorry. Questions are now being raised about whether he could actually be investigated over sex trafficking by the Met and also the abuse of his position as a trade envoy by the National Crime Agency. Finally, it looks like there's been a huge cover-up, that the palace knew about this and didn't deal with it. And so there are questions not just for the Met and the National Crime Agency, but for Buckingham Palace as well.
So this has been a hugely important week for the Epstein scandal, and it's looking like Keir Starmer's position is in serious threat. Can you just give us an idea of why this is so serious for Peter Mandelson?
I think it's very serious for Peter Mandelson. I think he'll go to jail. I mean, he was leaking confidential information, insider information to bankers and people in the way that Andrew was leaking material to his banker, in effect, David Rowland. So I think that's why there's a good case against Andrew. And I think if charges are leveled against Mandelson, then I think it's going to be very hard not to do the same with Andrew. But I do think that Mandelson looks like he may be going to prison.
So I find it astonishing, and you made this point too in your Substack, that within 2 days of the allegations about Peter Mandelson coming out, we have the news that there is a full Met Police investigation and that the Cabinet Office are a part of this investigation. When it comes up, why has there been absolutely nothing from either of those organisations when it comes to Andrew? Because we've had news in the last week of him potentially profiteering from Helmand province in Afghanistan. We've had news both in your book when you spoke about David Rowland going to Gaddafi in a private jet with Andrew. Now we also have evidence that he was introducing Epstein to some of these people. Why has there been still no reaction from the authorities?
Well, because they're covering up. I mean, it's clearly it's a pretty rotten state, and this is why it's so important that all the files on Andrew's time as a trade envoy from 2001 to 2011 are released. They've used every device, the Foreign Office and Department of Business and Trade, not to release this material, which should be released under the Public Record Act, quite apart from freedom of information requests. And I think if the government is serious about this, they need to ensure that that happens. And I think also a parliamentary investigation into his time as a trade envoy with the former heads of UKTI, former ambassadors to Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, on oath and answering questions. But you're absolutely right. It looks like there's one law for the royals and one law for everyone else, when there's plenty of evidence to make a case for some sort of investigation. I don't think the Met can duck this any longer. And it does raise all sorts of questions about what else that the royals and perhaps have avoided, how else they've avoided justice.
And do you think the Mandelson scandal makes it more likely that Andrew will be prosecuted or at the very least investigated?
Well, if Mandelson is investigated and charges are brought, then I think it makes Andrew's position totally untenable. If the Met kind of dodge this and say, well, we haven't got enough evidence for a conviction, which I think is very unlikely, then I think they can say, well, this is the same with Andrew. I mean, plenty of people have produced all sorts of evidence for the Met, and they've kind of said nothing to see here. And I think people are getting a bit tired of that. This pressure is coming from social media, from the public in general, who just feel let down by the people who are meant to be running this country, whether it's politicians or diplomats or civil servants. It's back to the sort of problem that there is in the States of basically entitled elites thinking that they can operate the system to suit them.
So you posited about a week ago, you were writing about this PR briefing and the pony riding with Andrew, Beatrice and his granddaughter. And you said that it might suggest that there's something more coming in terms of the fact that we've had this coordinated PR plan. Now, it was actually reported last week that you were correct on that Buckingham Palace had advance warning of what was coming, and therefore they were able to accelerate the plans to Wood Farm and then, of course, Marsh Farm afterwards. Is that more evidence of a cover-up?
Yes, I mean, I'm sure that the Buckingham Palace has known a lot of this stuff. I mean, it was quite separate from the Epstein revelations. I mean, we've had people complaining to the palace for years. They've been sent away with a flea in their ear. Everyone from senior diplomats to members of the intelligence services. We've had the press had stories that Buckingham Palace denied to the press. Then they issued legal proceedings against them and threats. Then they threatened not to give them access to members of the royal family if they ran stories. I mean, they've tried desperately to suppress this story. story and to discredit anyone who has raised it, from Virginia Giuffre through to me. So I do think it's time for them to fess up and just say what they knew and what they did about it then and what they're going to do about it now. This is a crucial moment for the monarchy. It either makes itself fit for purpose for the 21st century, modernizes, is more open and transparent, not least about its finances, or it goes down the old path of never explaining anything, secretive trusts, offshore accounts. And on that route, they will lose the trust and respect of the British public, and they will deserve to.
And another thing that suggests a cover up to me is that both Private Eye and you have reported in the last few months that the Buckingham Palace have got this dossier about Andrew and Fergie's behaviour going back for the last 30 years. And they're using this as an insurance against Andrew and Fergie going even more rogue. But again, that suggests to me evidence of cover up. They have a dossier containing all of the evidence of a whole number of different scandals. And the palace's answer is to use this as a kind of control technique against the Yorks, when actually it should be used to help expose what they've been doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a dossier even before they got married. I mean, there were lots of things from Fergie's racy past that they discovered. But you're absolutely right. There is this dossier produced by PPOs. All these PPOs are not allowed to talk and say whether Andrew went back to Buckingham Palace the night of the Giuffre says he raped her, in effect. So yeah, this material's there. I know from doing the Duke of Windsor book that everything is reported back to the palace by the protection officers, and they've got plenty of useful sources. The intelligence services had Andrew and Sarah under surveillance because of the people they were associating with. And I agree with you. I think this material should come out. They should basically clean the stables and give a clean sweep of the thing so that when William comes to the throne, he's got a clean slate. At the moment, all Charles is doing is passing on the problem to his son.
And can you just explain to us the FOAI exemption for the royal family?
Well, it's Section 37. It is an absolute exemption, i.e., can never be challenged if it's the monarch or the direct line. Other members there's a public interest test, but I've never come across a case where that public interest was in the public interest as opposed to the royal family's interest. And they hide behind it. It's very difficult to challenge it because they just tell you. They don't have to really justify it. I've taken these things to the first tier tribunal, which is the court that deals with this. And my experience is that judges always invariably side with the royal family. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in the Harry Daily Mail case, because though the Daily Mail have a very, very strong case, and Harry doesn't deserve to win, I do have this sneaking suspicion that judges who just, bend over backwards if two words are mentioned, national security and royal family.
And we saw this week that Keir Starmer tried to use that excuse in Parliament in respect to Mandelson, but even his own Labour MPs made it very clear that that wasn't going to wash. So the Intelligence and Security Committee are going to have access to, by the looks of it, tens of thousands of emails relating to Mandelson in America. So you also made a really interesting point on Substack this week about Sir Lindsay Hoyle's intervention in the debate. Can you just explain the significance of that?
Yeah, I think there are two interesting bits of information about the relationship between Parliament and the Crown. Traditionally, they were kept very separate. Erskine May, which is the sort of Bible of Parliament, said that you basically MPs couldn't ask any questions about the royal family. Now, what Lindsay Hoyle has said is, yes, you can ask questions. He's a private citizen. But I think also this is now going to lead to the point where people can begin to ask questions about the royal family. We've got the Public Accounts Committee already looking at Crown Estate leases. And I think this is the sort of slippery slope. I've actually got 10 questions that have been put by Lady Boycott, Rosie Boycott, former editor of The Independent, in the House of Lords, asking why the files on Andrew have not appeared, what's happened to them, and then a series of questions about particular trips he made, particularly in places like Azerbaijan. And if they answer those questions, which I doubt, they'll throw out some exemption, then that really will be opening the floodgates, and we will be able to have lots of questions being asked, which is quite right. I mean, he was a taxpayer-funded civil servant on these trips. The other interesting thing, I think, was with Keir Starmer saying that he needed to follow his conscience, but he should be speaking to the Senate. Now, again, in the past, it's always been said by politicians, well, that's a matter for the royal family, it's up to them. This is suggesting a little bit of pressure on the royal family, and whether that was deliberate or not, I don't know. But that does signify a change in tone of how the royal family are going to be treated.
It was also announced this week that Thames Valley Police are assessing information in regards to an allegation of sex trafficking and Andrew in 2010, I believe, to Royal Lodge. Now, this has been brought about by the campaigning group Republic and might end up being a private prosecution. How significant is this? Would the police be doing this had it not been for Republic?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I knew about the private prosecution from Republic, and I know they were crowdfunding for it. I know that they were wondering whether the DPP would take on the private prosecution, say that they're going to do something, and then kind of shut it down because they got some control. That was one of the worries, and that's happened in the past. But I think it does put pressure on the DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions, to look at this and perhaps bring charges. Here's a second person trafficked to Andrew. I've got other stories, and I think others will emerge with these leaks. Other people may come forward. So I think there's a very good chance something might happen there. There's also an interesting story about Surrey police investigating some leaks about Andrew in what seems an incredible story of sort of satanic rites. And they're seeking more information from the FBI. Now, if that's the case, I mean, that is quite dark. I do know, talking to my intelligence contacts in states, that the FBI passed a file in 2022 to the Met about Andrew. That I wonder what's happened to that file. Why didn't the Met pursue that file? I mean, if the FBI felt it was sufficiently serious to share it with law enforcement here, why has it been buried? So I do think the commissioner, apart from the king, I think the commissioner should be making a statement. What have they been playing at?
And you alluded there to this extraordinary story that's in the Epstein Files, which relates to the murder of a child in Surrey, as you say. And another thing that's been highlighted from the Epstein Files is two stories that further kind of echo that narrative. Talk about bodies being buried at Donald Trump's golf course and also bodies being buried at Epstein's Zorro complex in New Mexico.
I mean, this is, something which is you would think it's science fiction. We have two different sources saying roughly the same thing. These are reports to the FBI that two women were buried in a golf course, I think close to owned by Trump, who died with rough sex. And one of the people who's named in the Epstein file has been for some time one of the, should we say, a well-known world leader, does have a penchant for rough sex and actually choking people. So people have complained about that. So if these things are followed through and if they can find some evidence to find out who was behind this, I mean, various names have been mentioned. I think a man called Robin Leach, who's now dead. And then this takes an even darker and more sinister twist than we thought. I'm beginning to describe this whole thing as Eyes Wide Shut meets Yes Minister meets The Crown.
The Epstein Files are a huge mix of credible evidence, of FBI interviews, but also of huge amounts of tips that have come in that might just have come in from, a valid member of staff who really did witness things, or could have just come in from someone who's a crank. How do you as a researcher distinguish between those two things?
Well, I've used FBI files a lot, most notably in the Mountbatten and Trader King books, but also for Guy Burgess, and have been working with the FBI, making putting requests in now for probably 30 years. You look at all the stuff that's come in. Clearly, the tips that come in, the complaints, you have to treat with a degree of skepticism, but often there is some truth in them, and it's worth following that trail to see if you can stand up anything. Quite often you dismiss it. You have to look at the credibility of the people who are making those complaints, and if they're separate complaints. I think the most important thing is to look at the cases where the FBI did follow these complaints and took them seriously, and then look at the investigations that took place. And you will often have, for example, interviews with some of these people. That's one of the things that, for example, the MI5 files are so useful because they do produce surveillance reports and interviews of people like Anthony Blunt and Philby and others. So it's not a bad source, the FBI files. They are reasonably open, actually, about opening stuff. And just because something doesn't always make sense when you first look at it, doesn't mean that there's not a kernel of truth there that might lead you to something that you can use.
And can you just tell us a bit more about what we found out about Andrew's business dealings in the last week? So one of the names that jumped out at me was David Stern. In fact, it was reported, I think, today that he sat next to the Queen at some event or other. And you wrote in Substack, I think yesterday or the day before, this email that Andrew had written to David Stern, where he was talking about how David and another chap could be the ghosts on the upside of an investment, as Andrew describes it. Who is David Stern, and what more do we know about Andrew's business dealings this week?
Well, David Stern is a rather shadowy figure. It's a name that kept coming up when I interviewed people. He was often on these trips, taxpayer-funded trips. He's, I think, based in Hong Kong, or was, German investor. He was director of Picture Palace Global, which was the what was meant to be the charity that turned out to be Andrew's business. And he didn't talk to me. He's never spoken. He's clearly a major figure. Andrew uses these kind of cutouts. I mean, Dominic Hampshire was another one that he used with the alleged spy Ten Bow. But he clearly is an important figure. He was clearly the front man. The royals do that. They have a cutout always, so that if there's a problem, that cutout kind of takes the flak. And yeah, I think there's again good question for David Stern to be questioned, because clearly he knows a lot about Andrew's business activities, being on these trips and being basically the guy who was kind of organizing some of this stuff. But you're absolutely right. I mean, all these looking for investment opportunities in places like Helmand Province, where we just fought a war with what hundreds of people killed, is pretty shocking stuff.
And another interesting thing that comes from the Epstein files is Epstein's awareness that he was being used. So, for example, he cuts off Sarah at some point because she's asking for too much. And there's also this extraordinary email that he sends to Mandelson where he says to Mandelson, it's always, Jeff, can you do this? Jeff, can you do that? What insight does that give us into the nature of relationships or friendships that Epstein had with these people?
Well, they were clearly very close. He'd been very generous to them. They were taking advantage of him. I mean, they treated him as just a sort of open tap. I mean, incredible. I mean, why should he bail them out? And I mean, what did they think he wanted in return for the large sums of money? He's not Father Christmas. But it's just the greed. You know, Mandelson is a multimillionaire, and trying to get £10,000 for the boyfriend's sort of course is ridiculous. Sarah the same. I mean, these people are bought so cheaply, and I think that's what both the Russian and the Chinese intelligence services realize, that if you want to penetrate the British establishment, the easiest way to do it is through the royal family, because there's very little scrutiny and several members of them are pretty greedy.
It's also interesting that a lot of these photos that have emerged, especially of Mandelson in his pants and Andrew, are quite grainy. Do you think this suggests that they were surreptitiously taken or even taken by hidden cameras?
Yes, I mean, we know that there were hidden cameras everywhere in Epstein's properties. I mean, people knew about them and they still didn't seem to shape their behavior. I think certainly the one of Mandelson in his underwear is hidden. The one of Andrew leering over a young prostrate girl when he looks into the camera is not. And I think one of the things is they've all felt so comfortable with each other. They're all taking selfies and pictures, not realizing that this, particularly Andrew, not realizing this was accumulating evidence against him. And that's how Epstein worked. He operated trading information, intelligence, compromise to intelligence agencies, people generally, so that he had them under his control. And I think there was a point where Andrew realized this and kind of went and pleaded with him. And I don't know what Epstein said. He probably would have sort of comforted him, said, no, we don't worry, it'll never be used. I think the interesting stuff is this stuff was picked up by the Palm Beach police years ago in the original investigations in 2008. There was a second raid on the home in Manhattan. In Palm Beach, it looks like there was a tip-off because a lot of the hard drives are gone. In Manhattan, what seems extraordinary is the FBI came and they left stuff. And then when they came back, all that stuff had clearly gone. So it's almost as if they didn't want to find it. We know from the Palm Beach that a man called Mark Dugan, who was a policeman there, was given some of this material, which found its way, like him, to the Soviet Union. And we now think, according to MI6 and a Sunday Times report, into the hands of Putin. There's no doubt that Russian intelligence has a lot of compromising material on Andrew, and I suspect others. And the interesting question is, why hasn't it been used? But Russian intelligence plays a very long game, and I suppose while they have someone under control, they don't need to release anything. But I suspect that there will be a lot of material released, and it won't be coming from the FBI.
You've spoken before about allegations of bribery regarding Andrew. What evidence do you have here? And could you just explain for the audience how central bribery is in the culture of countries like, say, Saudi Arabia, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan?
Yeah, well, certainly in the Central Asian republics, which are basically fiefdoms of Russian intelligence, everything is transactional. And the only way to do business is to pay bribes, and businesses know that. That's absolutely the same case in North Africa and the Middle East. And of course, been big arguments about British companies BAE is a good example, but BP also, of where the line draws between giving hospitality, paying bribes, etc. I know it happened through my wife's company, a company she worked for, just having to give bribes to South African leaders, for example, even just do business. So it seems to be pretty pervasive. I think what's worrying is we know that, for example, Andrew he never got it in the end, but he could have got a £3.85 million commission for introducing a Greek water company into Kazakhstan. There's a story which I wasn't able to put in the hardback for legal reasons, but I think is now pretty well known about the $5 million in a suitcase in Kazakhstan, which was his thank you for something he'd done. And the way Andrew operated was he affected introductions because he had clearly a very useful contacts book. He graced things with his presence, giving them some credibility. And he had very useful connections. He fast-tracked, for example, a banking license for the Rowlands in Saudi Arabia through a former member of his staff who is now working there. So there are a lot of questions about things. We know about him shoehorning meetings in China for David Rowlands and his son, changing the agenda. And that's why I keep saying we need to know who are on these trips and why they're on these trips and what they were doing.
And over in Norway, they're having their own scandal, which parallels what's going on here in the UK. So, firstly, you have Marius Borg, who's on trial for rape, assault, and drug offences. And then his mother, Princess Mette Marit, is heavily implicated in the Epstein files. What's the significance of this? And do you think the contrast in how they are dealing with their scandal makes it more challenging for the British monarchy to continue in the way in which they're dealing with the scandal here?
Yeah, well, I mean, Epstein liked the idea of mixing with royals. He could see that that was, again, an easy way into the establishment. And so several people clearly have kept their distance. But the situation in Norway, I think, is very interesting. They've been slightly more open about how they've dealt with it than the British. And I think there's a lesson there. I think the real lesson was in Spain, where Felipe basically distanced himself totally from his father. And I think some of the sons-in-law actually went to prison. King Juan Carlos escaped to Dubai and under the radar, which is what I think will happen to Andrew. But I mean, they kind of shut the story down very effectively in Spain. I think Norway is sort of the halfway house, and I'm afraid Britain is again the lagger. I mean, all the reputation management people will tell you need to address the problem, you need to apologize, you need to show that this won't happen again, you need to have some form of disciplinary action. And none of those things are happening here. It's just silence and the hope the problem will go away.
So, yesterday, both the King and the Queen in separate incidents were heckled. What effect do you think that's going to be having on Charles and Camilla at the moment? And do you think it will affect how they go on to act in the coming weeks?
Yes, absolutely. I think it was the heckling of the king at Lichfield that really persuaded him to make that statement last October, where he was ruthless with Andrew, the sort of just the gesture he should have made months, even years before. He doesn't like this heckling. It's not a good look. And particularly when it's not just him, but other members of the royal family. Other members of the royal family may be putting pressure on him, saying, look, no one has covered any of the things we've done over the last couple of months. It's undermining all the hard work we do, and indeed our reputations. And you need to get a grip of the situation. So I do think we will get a statement in the way that eventually the Queen gave a statement after Princess Diana's death. Whether that will be mealy-mouthed or will actually come clean about things, I just don't know. I mean, this is always the problem. The cover-up becomes worse than the original sin. And we're now moving into that territory. And if you look at social media or comments below articles, people feel very strongly about this. And that's why I think that, as I say, the monarchy is at a crossroads. They can't just sit this out and hope it's going to go away. It's not. And they're going to have to face up to this. It's not just a matter of defenestrating Andrew. It's a matter about showing that they're all squeaky clean. Those who haven't behaved well will be punished. And, people are calling for Charles's abdication now, that somehow he's involved in compromise and they want William, who is seen to be a clean pair of hands, to come in. That's quite a dangerous sign.
Over the years, the royal family has relied on moments of symbolism, which, because we're such a deferent society, have had an outweighed effect on the public's reaction. So, for example, we had the Queen with the Scottish referendum, where a small innocuous remark, which was actually planned by her advisors, was seen to have had a big effect. We also had her walking to Crathie Kirk Church after the initial Epstein allegations emerged, which was again a symbolic show of support for her son. It seems this week the royal family have tried again with this symbolism, and what they've tried to do is to use the move to Marsh Farm as evidence that they are taking action. But do you think the idea of him moving from a very large mansion to a smaller mansion is just seen as derisory and not sufficient by the public?
Yes, I mean, that's seen as insulting to our intelligence, that somehow that's some big penalty. We know that he hasn't, in effect, lost his title, that if he wanted to use it, let's say in the Middle East or for doing business, he could. Everyone would say, well, I mean, there's been a whole campaign, don't victimize the man. He's suffered enough. He's never admitted to anything. He's not been tried in court. The daughters are innocent collateral. There's a whole line being pumped out through certainly particular papers. And I don't think people are buying it. And I'm amazed that some of the papers have run this line. The Telegraph ran a line saying the king has done as much as he can. But he could of course do a lot more. We had this situation where he said he couldn't do anything, and then suddenly he could. And he is bankrolling Andrew, I suspect. He is the king. I'm sure there's pressure, even if it's exerted through what's going to happen to the daughters, to persuade Andrew to talk, perhaps. I mean, I think it's very unlikely because all Andrew would do is incriminate himself. So I think what they're going to try and do is sweep it under the carpet by basically Andrew disappearing, not just to the Sandringham estate, but to somewhere in the Middle East. And in the hope people forget about him. It'll be very hard to find him on a compound in Abu Dhabi.
And just finally, the power Queen Elizabeth II had when she was the monarch was unrivaled. And when she said jump, people said, how high? Is Charles as powerful and influential as king within the royal family as his mother or not?
No, I don't think he is. I think, we're quite openly getting briefing against him from other members of the family, the tensions between him and William, for example, the problems again between him and Harry and how he's playing it. It's a sign that he is weak in how he dealt with Andrew. We're hearing stories about the ditherer, about a whole series of things where he can't make up his mind and thinks he can kind of sit it out. So yeah, I think he's actually quite a bit like Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer is going to go this week, I suspect, and I don't suggest Charles is going to go, but I do think he's been shot below the level, and he is very weakened now. I think William will increasingly call the shots, and though Charles isn't going to abdicate, I do think he's a much weakened person as a result of this. And what's so sad is that he had terrific respect when he acted ruthlessly last October. But a lot of briefing about whether it's William pushing this or Charles, a line that, Charles's side is saying, oh, yes, no, he realizes the problem. Nothing in all my studies of Charles say that he is prepared to grasp problems, whereas everything I learnt about William suggests that he and Catherine do.